All right, welcome back to the Tactical Pause podcast. I'm Kevin Price.
I'm Kevin Reed.
And if you haven't done so already, I definitely encourage you to subscribe to the channel. It's really the best way to support what we're doing here. So today we have something special for y'all. We actually have two guests today for our conversation about Christian nationalism. And our first guest is Susan Turpin, who was born and raised in Texas and has since relocated to the Pacific Northwest at the beginning of the pandemic. She has worked with both the Texas Democratic Secular Caucus as treasurer and American Atheist as an assistant state director, which translates well into her being incredibly familiar with just how sinister religion can be. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And our other guest today is none other than Terry Pettijohn, who was raised Baptist in West Texas. However, he has come to realize that it is not the same religion in which he was raised. He also served with the Texas Democratic Secular Caucus as vice chair and was on the school board for Lamarck Independent School District. And he's also served and continues to serve in various community organizations. Thank you for coming on the show today, Terry.
Great being here, Kevin.
Absolutely. Now, I want to jump right into questions. The first thing, for listeners who may not know what Christian nationalism is, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
My definition of Christian nationalism has always sort of been a conflation between being patriotic and being Christian. There's this sort of implied, or not really implied anymore, considering how blatant people are these days. There's this sort of idea that if you're not a Christian, then you're not actually patriotic. And I think it went from being sort of something that was not being said out loud necessarily to now they're just embracing it, whole hog. And they're saying, yep, we're Christian nationalists. Absolutely. And it's dangerous now. Well, it's always been dangerous, but it's more pervasive these days, I think.
And what I like to do is I like to look at the actual definition that a lot of scholars look at, and that is the belief that the country was founded as a Christian nation and should remain one from top to bottom. And then they want to introduce like the Ten Commandments in the classroom and exclude all other religions, that Christianity is the one true religion. And that's what just drives me crazy.
I remember growing up, I was raised in the Methodist Church in rural Missouri, and we were raised on the gospel, the Matthew 25 parable, right? The two commandments Jesus leaves you with is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and love all the creation that the Lord thy God has placed around you. And yet today, we clearly have seen that different. I guess my question to you guys is, what points do you find that the influence of Christian nationalism in politics has become dangerous?
Ooh, my specific one actually was something that I don't remember the original gentleman that sort of coined the term, but I know Allie Beth Stuckey really glommed onto the idea of toxic empathy. Allie Beth Stuckey is a relatively famous, right-wing anti-abortion activist, and they very much glommed onto this idea of the sin of empathy and toxic empathy, and having compassion for other people has now become a bad thing. It's so much that they forget that, like you were saying, the main commandments that Jesus realistically left us with, one of which is love your neighbor as yourself. And that's such an important thing. And I think a lot of Christians just completely forget about that these days. And they've brushed that to the side for this idea of the Jesus that they want him to be. And it does such a disservice to the actual chill guy that Jesus was.
Yeah, and when I read Christopher Hitchens, and he talked about Hitler and how the Germans were. And in 1928, Hitler had the quote, "We tolerate no one in our ranks who attacks the ideas of Christianity. Our movement is a Christian movement." And as we move down the road of these folks today, I see this over and over. And also Hitler also said, "My feelings as a Christian point me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter." And that's what they seem to be doing, is being it's like it gotten to be a war. And anybody that's not a Christian, that they're declaring war on. And I just find that extremely dangerous. That's what they did to the Jews. They declared war on the Jews. In the 1930s, Germany was almost 100% Christian, about 70% Lutheran, about 30% Catholic. And yet they killed 6 million Jews. And what that means is those were Christians that were doing most of that killing.
I know this movement of Christian nationalism seems to be very visible right now, but to your point about some of the historical context, do y'all feel that Christian nationalism has always existed in some form?
I think there's been some, when you had the KKK, they were a Christian organization, absolutely a Christian organization. And they, again, uh, didn't allow Jews in country clubs and all kinds of discrimination. So I think it's always existed somewhat here, but now I feel like it's spreading to more of the mainstream. When you look at Ken Paxton or Dan, our lieutenant governor, I mean, it's just they're just out there so upfront and obnoxious about it.
I completely agree. And I think a lot of people tend to forget when Barack Obama was president, they would essentially make these figures of him being lynched and would burn, likenesses of him and everything. And they would say that he was a Muslim, like as if that was necessarily like, an evil thing. But they do it under this guise of Christianity, and they sit there and say, well, we're the good guys. We're the ones who are doing life the proper way in accordance with Jesus's teachings. And last time I checked, I don't think Jesus wanted us to, burn people necessarily. I mean, God might want to, but Jesus not so much.
And I kind of think, I remember growing up in the church and we always had those examples. Even James Dobson was so big in the 90s for a lot of those Protestant, especially rural churches, I've come to understand. And they had this just god awful video series that my mom made me watch. It was like Mac and Me, except the Mac was an animated dwarf. And they had like all these Christian lessons about, garbage in, garbage out. We don't consume, media we don't like. And so I want to know your guys' perspectives because I have that. But like, what are some other things you guys have noticed about, some of those Christian nationalism things that are like historic examples like that? Like it's sneaky how it's been put almost into American life that way. But I think there's some things that now that it's become more mainstream that we can point to and say, hey, these things have been here for all this time. And this is how these churches have always given their sermons from, have always given their points of view from. So I want to kind of, what are your perspectives on that?
Well, I'd like to, if you can talk about historical things, I think back, I don't know if y'all are old enough to remember, there was a lady, Anita Bryant. Had been a Miss America in the 60s, and she led a crusade against gay folks. And it was all religious based. And to me, that's very, very close to aligning with the Christian nationalists, is that us versus them kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. And sort of to your point about the, the Mac and Me stuff and children's specifically media that people have to sort of replace secular media with, quote unquote, they use secular like it's some sort of dirty term. My friends and I have a lot of fun watching really bad old shows. So we fairly recently, watched The Donut Repair Club, which is by a gentleman who he's a converted Catholic, so he's not like a cradle Catholic. But he does children's media with, a lot of the ideas of if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. And if you disobey your parents, you're going to get punished really severely. He does a lot of that sort of thing that used to be a little more extreme, But these days it's not nearly as extreme, but his message hasn't really changed in the last 25-30 years, and he's still doing his thing. He still has a website with all sorts of like videos for sale, and I mean they're DVDs, so I don't know who still technically even has a DVD player at this point. It's all Blu-ray, but he sells like puppets and stuff. It's pretty great. But also Veggie Tales. Like Veggie Tales, I think, is sort of the precursor to getting more into some of the more harmful stuff, because Veggie Tales has always sort of introduced itself as being, very lovey, very much sort of, we want people to be open to our message, but then the church will use that for the little kids in order to get them in and then teach them more stuff about all of the harmful stuff that religion has a tendency of doing.
Yes, Veggie Tales, the gateway drug to Christian nationalism, as we all suspected.
I knew it. I knew it the whole time.
Well, I find it interesting. We have candidates like James Tallarico, who is very much a Christian man, but he also speaks out about Christian nationalism. I've even seen Ilya Omar, who's a Muslim, speak out about the same thing. And it seems that people are able to disconnect themselves from policy with their religion. But a lot of people feel like Christian nationalism is somehow attacking Christianity. You hear the war on Christianity and all this hoopla, which is complete garbage. But how does Christian nationalism affect policy, and how can we kind of break through to some of these people?
That's a really, really good question. Specifically that second part, that's one of those like, oh my, how do you get through to a lot of people? I mean, it's affected policy in so many ways, and it's specifically with, Project 2025 is based on Christian nationalist ideas, which a lot of people said don't worry about, and look where we are now. And a lot of my sort of pet, not necessarily like a pet project, but my main cause for a very, very long time has always been reproductive justice activism. And a lot of what's happening, I know definitely in Texas and in a lot of the very southern states, has been very like the anti-abortion sort of movements. And that is so based in this patriarchal idea of the control of women and everything like that. And that is based in the Christian nationalist ideals. How we get through to them is, ooh, that's something I've thought a lot about at various times. Because I don't remember who exactly said it. I'm wanting to say it's been attributed to Matt Dillahunty, but I don't think he's the original one to say it. But that you can't logic somebody out of a position that they weren't logicked into. Who was that said that, Terry?
Well, there's been several, absolutely several. But I do
Yeah.
think, have you ever watched Anthony Magnabosco,
Mhm.
who prowls the campus of UTSA?
Yeah.
And he uses the Socratic questioning, and that to me seems to be the thing that can get the crack in there. And I've also even heard him say that it's worked on some of the parents who are Trump supporters, and that to ask these questions of, well, what particular policy do you really like about, that Trump's enacted, and those kinds of things, and why do you believe what you believe? And that seems to have a better effect because it's kind of a sneaky backdoor situation to get people to think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the premise of asking somebody why they believe what they believe, because it's something that people don't really take into consideration very often. They don't take
Yeah.
into consideration why I necessarily think the way that I do and believe the things that I believe, because they're just taught this is the way that life is, and this is the way life works, and this is the way that you have to be. And they don't take into consideration that there might be other ways that they can think and they can act and they can do things.
when I was a kid, we went to the Baptist church, and some of my aunts and uncles were Church of Christ, and I always thought, why were they Church of Christ and we were Baptist? You know what was why didn't we all go to one church? That was always something that puzzled me, and of course I never asked.
Yeah, I remember my mother's family has an indigenous roots to it, and how much church was much more of a social statement to them than it was an actual belief system. And so usually it was like circling the wagons when they're all, getting in there. And it's just amazing to me because like I still see that today, and I still see this if you're not a Christian in my image type of ideology on how they kind of shun people from society, or at least attempt to, oh, she's a Muslim or he's an Islamist, especially when they're talking about like Zohran Mamdani and stuff like. So, it does affect non-Christians in a lot of ways. And so I want to know how your perspectives are on like what happens to people who aren't Christians like us. Like I'm an atheist as well, who disagree non-politically. Like what have been the blowbacks to you guys that you've seen?
Well, I've been pretty quiet, to be honest, because my family was so right-wing Baptist, and but until recently, and now I've become very outspoken. I didn't come out to my sister, who's 21 years older than me, until the day after Trump was elected the first time, and I actually said to her, and I quote this: "If there was a God, Donald Trump wouldn't be president," and that's truly how I feel. And but it's just a fine line you walk, for sure.
Yeah, I have been incredibly fortunate with the people that I have surrounded myself with because funnily enough, so the story of my mother becoming an atheist is much funnier than the story of me becoming an atheist, because my mother, when my sister and I were children, we went to an Episcopalian church, and my mother was really involved with a lot of stuff with the church, and she was in the choir and all sorts of stuff like that. And she said one day she was sitting in the choir loft and a light bulb just sort of went on over her head, and she was like, well, I apologize, I didn't ask. Can I curse on here, because this is part of it. Because,
You
okay.
haven't listened to their podcast much,
No,
have
I'm
you?
so sorry. I just want to be 100% sure. I hate to like disrespect someone's space.
Say whatever you want.
Wait, my mother, she's in the choir loft, and she said a light bulb went off in her head, and she just said, well, this is bullshit, isn't it? And so she was an atheist from, a very young age for me. So I never really had to necessarily come out as an atheist or come out as, leftist or anything like that. And a lot of my family are very much super, super left-leaning. They're fantastic people. But I did find, funnily enough, when I had gotten out of a relationship, this was really funny. This is like 15 years ago. It was on OkCupid or something like that, and I had put in my bio that I was an atheist, and I spent a lot of time with the local atheist group back home in Corpus Christi. And I distinctly remember one guy messaging me and was like, LOL, local atheist group, what do they even do? Sit around and talk about not God? Like, yes, that's pretty much like that's it. We talk about everything but, essentially. So it's it hasn't been something that I've necessarily faced a lot of stuff in my personal life, but I know there's so much. Like, I'm very open about being an atheist and being on the left, but there's some people who sort of go, oh my, really? Like, a lot of people are very surprised about it because they sort of assign morality and an ethical nature to being a Christian. And while I'm not one, obviously,
Well,
they see somebody who is so, like, I like to think of myself as a very compassionate person, and a lot of people just sort of automatically lump me in with Christians. I'm like, no, that's not really me.
I actually say that I think I follow Jesus more than 95% of Christians because they don't do what the Bible says.
Right.
And if you start reading the Bible, and I'm very big on quoting the Bible to them, and they go, well, the Bible doesn't say that. I said, well, here it is. It's Exodus 21. It endorses slavery. Oh, no, that's not slavery. I mean, how can you read that and not say that the Bible endorses slavery? Well, that's the Old
Right.
Testament. But I don't think we should get into criticizing religion too much. But it is part of the Christian nationalism that we have to make people think about.
Mhm.
Well, and the books of the Bible have since antiquity been rewritten for political causes. The New King James Version of the Bible emphasized, fealty to your masters because that's what enabled the nobility. And so I think when you look back, it's been indoctrinated, especially in working class families, since the Dark Ages, right? Once Rome fell and the Catholic Church could finally take over the religious and the day-to-day life of most of Western Europe, I think that you really see how that's been ingrained. I mean, it goes back to, even when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the doors, those were revolutionary simply because they said the church shouldn't have that kind of authority. But it never negated a lot of the Christian belief system that was ingrained into those societies and all that iconography with kings and crusaders and the Holy War, going to
And,
war. You still get that iconography as an American soldier. Is you're doing this because it's the moral and ethical right thing to do, with a wink and a nod back to those Christian,
Yeah.
back to those crusaders. So there is a continuity there. So I think that we can say there's a lot of this that's been ingrained for generations and generations that we don't know. At the same time, we say, hey, look, we now have the obligation that we recognize it to unlearn these systems and unlearn these systems of power and then re-enable them essentially to work for the working class rather than against them.
and going back to the German, and I was so shocked when I heard this, that the German Nazi belt buckle, it has a swastika on it, but it also has Gott mit uns on it. And that means God is with us. And I was just shocked when I saw that the Nazi belt buckle had that on there. And if that wasn't a Christian nationalist government, I don't know what was.
Yeah, it's very gross to put it bluntly. It's very gross how people these days have just sort of glommed on to that same frame of mind. It's really disturbing. It's really disturbing that
Yeah.
people are still willing to, repeat history, basically.
Well,
Yeah.
and do you guys find that like it's easy to say something like, hey, this is an ideology of mediocrity? This is a subservience ideology. You are not able to be free. You're subservient to somebody else's master to tell you. Do you think that that kind of explanation would help?
That's a very good point. I think that's a very good way of putting it, because a lot of Christian nationalists, and I don't know if it necessarily is part of Christian nationalism where it's just something that's sort of a pattern, they espouse these ideas of freedom and personal freedoms and all of this sort of thing. And you're not super duper free if you're going to be if you're gonna have to literally bow down to people, especially. And I think people sort of forget that. They forget that a lot of the time.
It never ceases to amaze me. We have the Moms for Liberty down here. They're banning books, and a lot of those books they've never read before. They're on the list. There's this like uh, national group that says these books should be banned. Those people never read those books. They just follow. They're very good at following what the authoritarians say, and that's kind of what a religion is.
Well, I have a question. Because we pride ourselves in religious freedom in the United States, right? So, you're free to be an atheist, you're free to be a Christian, a Muslim, whatever you want to be, right? Um, but we also don't want religious dominance in our government. So how do we protect religious freedom and also keep from creating that, religious dominance in our government at the same time? Is there a way to balance it?
I think as long as people are willing to understand the idea that your right to swing only goes so far as the other person's nose, I think as long as people are willing to accept and embrace that idea, then they're going to have a much better grasp on what it means to let people be people. I think we're so consumed, and I don't know if it's necessarily a human thing. It probably is just sort of a people thing rather than necessarily any sort of subsect of people. But I think a lot of people are very consumed with what other people are doing and what other people are saying, and they're less concerned about themselves and if they're appearing to be, hypocritical for whatever reason. And I think if we just sort of live and let live as long as you're not harming others, if we followed that a little bit more closely, I think people would have a better grasp on the lack of religious dominance.
And I think that would be great, but the Christians just can't help themselves. They want to hold power.
Right.
My brother-in-law was a progressive Baptist. I know that sounds a little odd, but in the late 70s, when the far right Christians took over the Southern Baptist Convention, he was very disappointed. And when they went into the seminary and they fired several of his favorite professors that he had, and they made him sign an oath to the one way of their way of Christianity, and so it's just they look for prominent positions of cultural and political power, and if we don't go out and vote and eliminate, do the same thing, and unfortunately, Democrats just don't seem to turn up like Republicans will. The Republicans have fire in their belly. And too many of the Democrats just don't have that fire. And it's like a religious fervor.
Yeah.
I always kind of feel like the Democrats right now are in the middle of like the same thing the Republicans were in 2010 when the Tea Party took over. You've got like this feckless top leadership at the top that is, clearly bought off, not interested in doing anything but the status quo. So I hope that changes. I think that we do have something to offer, and I want to know what you guys think about coming out and saying that the mythology that is being peddled by Christian nationalism is not just not congruent with the Bible, but it is an ideology of enslavement. It is not meant to help you. It is not meant to do anything else. So at some point, like, we have to do things, right? Even if we don't want to have some of these voters back at our table, we do need to help them be somewhat on their own. So like, what are your perspectives on like what we can do, because obviously we can't speak to them. They're not willing to listen to us, but what are some policy objectives that might be put forward that can be beneficial in this environment?
What I think we have to do is be able to tell our story better. I think that Democrats and our secular humanists, our atheists, we've done a very, very poor job of telling our story. And I'm not going to mention my group because I know Kevin Price will go, yeah, he got it in. But we need more leaders to step up. And how do we develop those leaders? And we've got to start with young people and really tell our story, because the Republicans have defined us and the Christians have defined us. We're not bad people, but yet we're the ones that are just run into the ground, and we're awful, and we no morals. And I'd say that we have more morals because we're good people, because that's the right thing to do, not because we're going to hell.
Yeah, not having an incentive for having to be a good person, I think, baffles a lot of people a lot of the time. No, I actually absolutely agree with Terry. I think a lot of times it will start with reaching out to younger voters and the people who are coming into their own in terms of what their own policy positions are and what they think is best. I think if we are able to let these people know that, yeah, Republicans may talk a lot of smack and they may say, oh, Democrats are horrible and, they're the devil and whatever. I think Democrats have kind of rolled over on that, and they're just sort of like, well, they're saying it, there's kind of no point in fighting back. And I think, I think they need to fight back a little bit more. B, I think getting to these young people, and it kills me to say that because I'm still convinced that I am a young person. And I'm still like, oh,
we all are young. Susan.
Exactly. I think letting people know how stuff works, because notoriously, as we can see basically all over the country, and especially in Texas right now, with how gerrymandered a lot of stuff is, a lot of people don't understand how that works, and a lot of people don't understand how processes work. And I think making it to where it's more accessible, because that's something that's always really, really daunting. If I hadn't been super involved in politics in general when I lived in Texas, then I would have been like, I don't know what's going on. I'm very confused. I don't know what's happening. And it's so daunting. And that's completely an understandable position to have, because it's so much to have to absorb. It's so very much to have to sort of take into consideration and understand. And I think as long as we're willing to basically do, and I realize sometimes this is kind of said in a derogatory manner, but I think if we're able to sort of explain like I'm five, a lot of the stuff, that's why Schoolhouse Rock was so important. Like Schoolhouse Rock broke stuff down into very, very easy to understand bite-sized chunks. And the fact that we don't have stuff like that anymore is
And
really detrimental.
and what I tell people all the time is, my observation is, most people do not understand city, county, state government. They don't understand what the function of each one is. And I'll use the example of an appraisal district.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand here we in Texas, we have a separate appraisal district, and they do the appraisals for all the entities. Well, they blame the city for the rise in the appraisal. It's not the city that has done it, it's the appraisal district. Now, the city sets the rate, and you could have a house that's worth twice as much, but you don't pay more taxes necessarily because the rate goes down. If everybody's house is doubled, then the rate will cut in half. But there's just a complete lack of fundamental knowledge of government and how it works.
I want to circle back to some of the criticisms of the Democratic Party. I know I'm not supposed to talk about my side, but I'm going to. Christian nationalism, while I will say it's more prevalent on the right, I feel like the Democratic Party, to some extent, is a little blasé to it. Because I know when we were on the board for the Texas Secular Caucus, we had several atheist candidates that were endorsed, but I don't think a single one of them got elected. It's still very, very hard to get elected as an atheist, even as a
Yep.
Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
We say we're a big tent party and all that, but Democrats don't even want to vote for, well, I'm a Democrat that would vote for an atheist, but unfortunately, I think a majority will not. And then one of our first issues I think we went after was Article 1, Section 4 of the Texas Constitution, which I don't know if y'all remember, it requires office holders in the state of Texas to acknowledge the existence of a higher power, which is
Yeah.
archaic, it's unenforceable, and it's really just dead language in the state constitution.
Mm-hmm.
But when we went to, representatives to take it out, they're like, it's not really an issue. It's not really a big deal because nobody can enforce it or whatever. But there's Republicans that I've heard talk like it is enforceable when it's not. And the same with conversion therapy. At one point, I went to the Houston City Council, and a city council member told me, well, it's not really an issue here right now, so we don't really need to create an ordinance for it or anything like that. And now the person that we, protested near Dallas, David Pickup,
Mm-hmm.
who is a notorious conversion therapy advocate, he moved his operation to Houston. So,
Mm-hmm.
now it's relevant, I think. So I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is Democrats say they're against Christian nationalism, but at the same time, we're very complacent when it comes to really doing anything about it. And I don't know what can be done.
I think, as much as I hate to use the word pester, like, because that's sort of what I always say when I'm sort of talking to people about stuff, is like, I really hate to pester you. But you have to not be afraid of being like, hey, this is an issue that is really important to me as your constituent. This is something that I feel, even if you don't think it's important right now, it's coming down the pike, and you need to understand that this is something that is a definite problem with society and with how things are being handled right now. And I think, yeah, Democrats have always just sort of been like, and it bothers me so much. They roll over so much. I'm so sorry. But I think if people are more willing to sort of speak up and make their voice be heard, because I think it pairs along with the fundamental misunderstanding of how government works. They don't understand that in order to have your representatives know what's important to you, you have to be able to reach out to them, and you have to be able to say, hey, this is something that's really important to me. And we always say stuff like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you tell somebody often enough, and if they hear enough voices say it, then they're going to be like, okay, this is something that is genuinely important to people. That's what bothers me about the conversion therapy thing not being a problem, is that because it is a definite problem. It's a problem all over the country. It's a problem that is growing because like so few people knew about it, when we were doing a lot of our protests. And I think the fact that more people know about it now makes it so that it's like, hey, this is something that's really a problem. And if you know something's a problem and you don't try at least to do something about it, and you become kind of complacent, then it's not directly contributing, but it is somehow contributing to it being a problem. And yeah, it's just so very frustrating. I can sort of see how they would be like, well, with the Article 1, Section 4, it's dead language, whatever, but that's still a problem. And I think they just haven't heard enough people complain about it, which is so frustrating.
And I can understand their perspective as an elected official, because when you bring something up like that 70 or 80% of the people don't think it's a problem, that can get you unelected. And I think sometimes we Democrats are the purists that they can't always see the forest for the trees or see the big picture. You saw that with Kamala Harris, the fact that she would have been a much better candidate than Donald Trump, or Hillary Clinton would have been a much better candidate, immensely more qualified.
Yeah.
But there was, well, she's not this, she's not that, blah, blah, blah. We get Trump.
Yeah.
It's all that ingrained stuff. Like I grew up in a small town in the southwest corner of Missouri. There was a Christian boarding school called the Agape School in Stockton, Missouri. It was like our parents, I don't think my parents ever intended it, but that was like the threat when I was misbehaving. Like, hey, if you keep this up, we're going to send you over there for a while. Conversion therapy and stuff started there. Like these were like the fundamentalist Christians in rural parts of Missouri whose kids were too artistic, too into theater. Kids like me, right? Kids into Weird Al, kids into Mystery Science Theater 3000, kids into doing funny like slapstick comedy on stage. Like these were the kids that didn't fit into that society, and those are the laboratories of Christian nationalism, are those like troubled teen Christian schools that really get carte blanche cover to do these sort of tactics as an initial instance. Like the stories coming out of there are not just horrific, but are almost like it's an accepted version of not just slavery, it's an accepted version of child abuse. And I think that Democrats have to come to terms with that and say, there is a part where we have to say, where you are, your religious beliefs are in the child abuse territory, your religious beliefs are in child neglect and are in child exploitation. And we can never accept that. There is no political advantage to accepting the harm to children and harm to the ability for a child to learn and grow in their own environment.
Yeah. I think one thing definitely to that point, the Christian boarding schools have been in operation for such a long time. And that's how they have eradicated a lot of the indigenous American population. And we hear stories, well, not just indigenous American, or I guess the Americas, because we find that problem in Canada as well, where there's these boarding schools specifically for indigenous children that are basically conversion centers in order to try and beat their culture, beat their religion, beat their, everything out of them, their identities out of them. And if they don't give in, as we have seen in multiple places in the world, a lot of times the children end up dead. And that is still a problem. Like the boarding schools like that are still a big problem. And I think just Just get rid of
I
them.
just,
The whole
I
thing.
just watched a documentary on the cult of 12 tribes, and this was from 2018, and fairly recent. And literally, he read a Bible verse about, we all know about, spanking children and spare the rod, blah, blah, blah. But he also read one where it said, if you make it blue, then that's even better to really ingrain it. And he literally beat some of these kids almost to death. They were black and blue from the neck down to the bottom of their feet.
The interesting thing is some of the things that Christian nationalists have beef with on the left are just really non-existent issues also, like prayer in school. We need to bring back prayer in school. And the interesting thing about that is prayer really never left school. I mean, you
Mhm.
could pray all you want. You just can't make everybody else pray. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
If you're a Christian, you don't want to pray, go ahead. You know,
Yeah.
nobody's stopping you.
Mhm.
It's just such a non-issue.
It's so asinine. Like Madeline Murray O'Hare was, the most hated woman in the world because she notoriously, helped remove prayer from school, like coerced prayer from schools, but it never went anywhere. It never went anywhere. Every single moment of silence, every single, bit of the day that you have to yourself, like you are free to pray. Just don't make me do it. You see a lot of instances, especially in Texas, where they'll have like football games and stuff, where they'll have a coach lead a prayer, for the whole entire stadium, or they'll have a coach have the entire team kneel and pray, and they'll alienate the kids who don't do it. And I know there's been coaches, I'm pretty sure this was a guy in Texas, and it was a while back, but he was basically almost forcibly baptizing his football players. And yeah, he got fired for that. And then he like fought the firing. But yeah, I don't remember the actual final outcome of everything, but it was I remember that being a whole thing.
Yeah, I'd like to see how the Christian nationalists would react if they were forced to have a school-sponsored Muslim prayer.
It'd be panic in the streets. I'm convinced of it.
Well, because harkens back to that, Western civilization sort of ideology that we had in American schools from like the Cold War on, right? Like we're the Christian, white Christians that are going to save the world from the godless atheists. And so I think, I remember growing up when the Cold War was still around. I mean, I was very young in elementary school, but we learned about the godless atheist and their lack of faith is what led them to bread lines and led them to austerity. And it wasn't the mismanagement of their government. No, it was their lack of belief in Jesus. And if they'd only believe in Jesus, they'd have food. And so I kind of trace back as I start to unlearn my, Christian upbringing into what is a reality. What is the reality is that there's this just almost, you have to be dependent on this. And if you aren't dependent, then you're just off in the nether and you're on your own. And that's a bad place to be. And it's just kind of funny because I've been okay, been fine.
Yeah.
I retired from the army. I kind of do some stuff on the side and I'm doing okay. It's all good. It's not a bad thing.
There was something that you had mentioned earlier, Kevin Price. Sorry. Are we gonna call you like Kevin 1, Kevin 2? I'm not entirely sure how to refer to y'all. There was something you did mention about, I think actually both of you might have mentioned about, we have to find like a bigger tent and stuff like that, and we have to be able to reach out to people. I distinctly remember when I still lived in Dallas, there was an event that I went to that had one of the, I believe she is a Texas House member. And it was a big deal that she had gotten elected because she's a lesbian and she was very outspoken about it. So it was a really big deal. And I was like, hey, have you considered reaching out to atheists? Because historically, and I know not all the time, but historically atheists are far more accepting of gay people than, your stereotypical Christian or anything religious person in that sense. She almost visibly recoiled when I said that. I was like, I'm an atheist. I think it would be really beneficial for you to, include and incorporate atheists into your campaign and maybe do like an outreach, because there's a lot of times that the atheist voting bloc feels very ignored. And we don't really get considered a lot of the time because we're very othered in the political aspect. And I think as long as we can reach out to people, maybe start building some more bridges. But she did not like that idea. She didn't like that idea at all, which was really discouraging. Because I know for a fact that if somebody had told a straight person, hey, you should consider, reaching out to the LGBTQ plus community, and they recoiled, that would have been like, and I hate saying that way. I really do. I realize how that makes me sound, and I deeply apologize. But it's really frustrating when people are so vehemently against the idea of making sure that your voice is heard, that they're not willing to even talk to somebody relating to that. Yeah, that was very frustrating. That was incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, I can't imagine. That's got to be, it's almost like you can kind of feel like in the moment how atheists have been just this toxic cesspool, like, oh no, like I like you personally, but no, we can never associate with that. That's definitely it. And it's the same. I think Missouri tries to be a microcosm of Texas in the sense of we just try to copy what y'all do. And we're not good at it, but we've got the hate down. Like I have no doubt that like I have family members who are very religious. I have no doubt that they care for me as a human being. I also know that they're just like, I'm the black sheep to them because of that lack of belief system. So, and that comes with the territory. It comes with like, do I want to pretend for acceptance or do I just want to be who I am? Yeah. I always chose to be who I was, but I can't imagine being in that environment where you feel like that's the obligation. You have to be something you're not simply just to survive. Like that to me is the insidious part of it.
Susan and Terry, I really appreciate y'all coming on today. They say that you shouldn't talk about religion and politics, and we successfully navigated both of those today. Do y'all have any closing remarks or anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'd just like to say that I want to thank KP and KR for doing this. I think a lot of the military, sometimes is looked on as Christian. And, my brother-in-law was actually a chaplain in the Army and retired from the Army, but it really opened his eyes when he was exposed to so many different religions and points of view.
Yeah, I guess the TLDR of everything that I have to say is reach out to atheists. Democrats, please. We want to vote for you. We do. We're just tired of feeling ignored.
If you did like the episode, I do want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel. It supports us. I'm Kevin Price.
Kevin Reed.
And thank you for joining us again on Tactical Pause.